The newborn baby is inside a hole, suffering and crying until a millionaire hears him and decides to help as quickly as possible. But before he picks up the baby, he feels a hard blow to the head, and after that, the worst happens to him and the baby. Stay until the end to find out what will happen. Be grateful and support my work by leaving a comment and subscribing to my channel. The fog hung over the highway like a grey shroud that winter morning. Richard Harding drove his luxury sedan back to Chicago, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel as he tried to process the failure of the meeting he'd just had in Milwaukee. 20 years building his company from the ground up, and now a single bad deal threatened to jeopardize months of work. The dark blue suit, his signature look, was impeccable as always, but inside he felt shattered. At 47, Richard had achieved everything money could buy, but at that moment it seemed to mean nothing. He slowed down as he passed a particularly winding stretch of the highway, surrounded by vacant lots. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees. But there was something different about that. Muffled sound, something that made his heart clench in a way he couldn't explain. He slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the shoulder, turned off the car, and listened in silence, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. It sounded like distant crying, almost inaudible. He got out of the car, adjusting his overcoat against the biting morning chill. His Italian leather shoes sank into the mud as he walked toward a deserted lot. The sound grew clearer with each step. Richard skirted a few bushes, his heart pounding harder. That's when he saw it, and the sight made him freeze in place, unable to process the scene before him. There, in a hole dug in the earth, was a baby, a newborn, skin purpled with cold, tiny hands clutching a worn and dirty teddy bear, one of the toy's ears hanging by a thread. The child was shaking violently, its lips already turning blue, sending Richard into a panic. Without thinking twice, he approached the hole, ready to pull the baby out. His hands trembled as he tried to reach the child as carefully as possible. It was at that moment that he felt the impact. Something or someone hit him hard in the back, causing him to stagger forward. When he turned around, he was faced with a little girl, no more than 5 years old. Her dark hair was completely matted, her ragged clothes barely protecting her thin body from the cold. But it was her eyes that caught Richard's attention, large, dark, and marked by deep circles, overflowing with a kind of despair that no child should ever know. "Stay away from him!" The girl's voice was hoarse and broken by sobs. She held a rock in one hand, her whole body trembling, from cold or fear, maybe both. "I won't let anyone take my little brother." Richard raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, trying to show that he wasn't a threat. The baby continued to cry in the hole, the sound growing fainter. "I just want to help," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the despair growing in his chest. "Your brother needs help." The girl shook her head violently, thick tears streaming down her dirty cheeks. "No, Mommy said she'd be back. She promised." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment Richard saw all the exhaustion and fear that this little creature carried on her shoulders. "How long has your mother been gone?" he asked softly, taking a small step toward her. The girl recoiled, clutching the rock tighter between her fingers. Three days, she replied, and Richard felt his heart clench even tighter. "But she'll be back. She always comes back." The words sounded as if she were trying to convince herself more than him. The baby's crying was getting weaker, and Richard knew he didn't have much time. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle as he tried to think of a way to convince her. Tabitha, she replied, and for the first time her posture seemed to waver slightly. "Tabitha, your little brother needs a doctor. It's very cold here, and he's very small." Richard spoke with all the sincerity he could muster. "I promise I won't hurt you. I just want to take you to a safe and warm place." The girl looked at the hole where her brother was, and Richard saw the conflict in her eyes. She was exhausted, hungry and scared, but the instinct to protect her brother still kept her standing. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I could have just grabbed your brother and left. But I'm here talking to you," he replied. "And because I promise I won't let anything bad happen to you." Tabitha seemed to consider his words for a moment that seemed like an eternity. The baby's crying had turned into a weak whimper, and Richard could see the panic growing in her eyes. Finally, the rock slipped from her fingers and fell to the ground with a thud. Her legs gave way, and she fell to her knees in the damp earth, sobbing. "Please," she begged, "save Samuel, please." Richard wasted no time. He ran to the hole and, with all the care he could muster, pulled the baby out. The child was freezing, its skin turning a shade that sent him into a panic. He took off his overcoat and wrapped it around the small body, keeping the teddy bear with him when he noticed that the baby's little fingers were still clinging to it tightly. He picked up Tabitha in his other arm. She was so light that it seemed she could break at any moment. He ran back to the car, placing the children in the back seat and turning the heater on full blast. As he drove toward the nearest hospital, he glanced in the rearview mirror every few seconds. Tabitha was bent over her brother, whispering words of comfort as she stroked his sparse hair with trembling fingers. What Richard didn't know, as he pressed the accelerator on that foggy morning, was that this encounter would change his life forever, and that the real nightmare was just beginning. The lights of the municipal emergency room flashed brightly as Richard parked the car. Little Samuel had stopped crying during the ride, and that silence was more frightening than any sound. Tabitha remained embraced to her brother, as if fearing that he might disappear if she let him go. "I need help!" Richard shouted as soon as he entered the hospital, carrying the two children. The medical team reacted immediately to the urgency in his voice. Within seconds, a stretcher was brought, and health professionals surrounded the baby. "He's suffering from hypothermia. Serious," one of the doctors said after a quick examination. "We need to warm him up immediately." They tried to take Samuel, but Tabitha refused to let go of her brother, clinging to him with all the strength her small body could muster. "No, I won't let anyone take him," she cried, the panic evident in her voice. The doctor looked at Richard, silently asking for help. He knelt beside the stretcher, getting down to Tabitha's eye level. "Look at me," he asked gently. She obeyed, her big eyes filled with fear. "Remember the promise I made, that I wouldn't let anything bad happen to you?" Tabitha nodded slightly, still holding on to her brother. "Then trust me one more time. These doctors are the only people who can help Samuel now, and I'll stay here with you the whole time." For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't give in. But then, very slowly, her fingers began to loosen their grip on her brother. The teddy bear slipped along with him, still clutched in Samuel's little hands. "The teddy bear needs to go too," a nurse said gently. "We need to clean the baby." "No!" Tabitha shouted again. "Fuzzy can't leave him. It was the last thing Mommy left us." Richard quickly intervened. "What if we clean the teddy bear too? That way he can stay close to Samuel, only cleaner. What do you think?" Tabitha considered the proposal for a few seconds before reluctantly agreeing. The nurse promised to bring the teddy bear back as soon as possible, and Samuel was finally taken to the emergency room. As soon as her brother left her field of vision, all the strength that had been keeping Tabitha standing seemed to drain away. She staggered, and Richard caught her before she fell. Only then did he notice how hot she was, burning with fever. "We need to examine her too," said the doctor, who was still there. Tabitha didn't protest this time, allowing them to take her to another room. She was too exhausted to resist. The tests revealed that, in addition to the high fever, Tabitha was severely malnourished and dehydrated. There were several bruises and scratches on her body, some older, some recent. Richard watched everything with a lump in his throat, imagining what that child had been through. "She needs an IV and antibiotics," the doctor explained, "and a lot of rest. It's a miracle she's lasted this long taking care of her brother in those conditions." As the nursing staff prepared the IV, Richard noticed that Tabitha was struggling to keep her eyes open. "You can sleep," he said, holding her small, cold hand. "I promise I'll be here when you wake up." "But Samuel?" she murmured, already almost asleep. "I'll take care of him too. Rest." Finally, after 3 days of constant vigilance, Tabitha allowed herself to rest. Richard stood there, watching her restless sleep, while a social worker was called to assess the case. The woman arrived about an hour later, introducing herself as Ms. Evans. Her face showed the experience of someone who had seen too many cases like this. "Can you tell me exactly how you found the children?" she asked, sitting next to Richard in the waiting room. He recounted everything in detail: the crying he heard, the baby in the hole, the desperate girl protecting her brother. With each word, Ms. Evans's expression became more grave. "And the mother? Did the girl say anything about her? Just that she promised to be back 3 days ago, and something about the teddy bear being the last thing she left." Ms. Evans made some notes on her clipboard. "I'll need to talk to the girl when she wakes up and start a search for the mother. Does the baby have a birth certificate?" "I have no idea. We didn't find any documents with them." At that moment, the doctor who was taking care of Samuel appeared. Her face was serious, and Richard felt his heart clench. "How is he?" he asked, fearing the answer. "We managed to reverse the hypothermia, but he's very weak. The malnutrition is severe, and there are signs that he was born prematurely. We also found insect bite marks, probably from the time he spent in that hole." She paused before continuing. "The next 24 hours will be crucial." Richard ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of the situation. How could someone abandon 2 children like that? "There's one more thing," the doctor continued hesitantly. "We found marks on the baby's body. Marks that suggest the delivery was done in precarious conditions, possibly without any medical assistance." Ms. Evans made more notes, her face increasingly worried. "That may indicate that the mother is in a situation of extreme vulnerability, or worse." She was interrupted by a scream coming from the room where Tabitha was. Richard ran there, finding the girl sitting up in bed, eyes wide with terror. "Samuel!" she screamed, trying to pull the IV out of her arm. "Where's my brother?" Richard ran to her, holding her hands gently. "Calm down, honey. Samuel is being taken care of by the doctors, remember? I promised I wouldn't let anything happen to him." Tabitha stopped struggling, but her whole body was shaking. "I had a bad dream," she murmured. "I dreamed that Mommy came back, but she wasn't Mommy anymore. She was different, with dark eyes. She wanted to hurt Samuel." She began to sob, and Richard hugged her instinctively. She clung to him as if her life depended on it. "No one is going to hurt you," he promised again, although an uneasy feeling began to grow in his chest. There was something in that dream, in the way Tabitha spoke of her mother, that left him deeply disturbed. Ms. Evans watched the scene from the door, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Harding," she called softly, "can I have a word with you?" Richard tried to pull away, but Tabitha tightened her hug even more. "Don't go," she begged. "Please don't leave me alone." "I'm not going anywhere," he assured her. "I'm just going to the door to talk to Miss Evans, okay? You can see me from here." Reluctantly, Tabitha agreed, although her eyes didn't leave him as he walked to the door. "Mr. Harding," Miss Evans began in a low voice, "I need to be clear with you. This situation is very delicate. We'll need to contact Child Protective Services, conduct a search for the mother, and in the meantime, the children will need to go to a shelter." "No." Richard's response was immediate and firm. "They're not going to any shelter." "Mr. Harding, I understand your concern, but there are procedures that need to be followed. I'll take responsibility for them, he declared, temporarily, until you find the mother or a permanent solution. I can afford to take care of both of them, and I've already established a bond with Tabitha. Sending them to a shelter now will only traumatize them further. Ms. Evans seemed about to argue, but at that moment they heard a commotion coming from the reception area. Voices, raised voices, hurried footsteps. "Where are my children?" a woman was shouting. "I know they're—" "Here, give me back my children." Tabitha, who had just begun to calm down, stiffened in bed. Her face turned ashen, and she began to tremble violently. "It's her," she whispered, her voice filled with terror. "Mommy's back." The shouting echoed through the hospital corridors, getting closer and closer. Richard saw the terror in Tabitha's eyes and acted on instinct, placing himself between the door and the bed where the girl was. The woman who burst into the room bore no resemblance to the image of a mother that Richard had in mind. Her disheveled hair framed a face marked by deep circles under her eyes. Her glazed and unsteady eyes scanned the room without really focusing on anything. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and she gave off a strong odor of alcohol. "Tabitha!" she shouted, staggering toward the bed. "Come here now! We're going home!" The girl cowered, clutching the sheets so tightly that the knuckles of her fingers turned white. Silent tears streamed down her face. "Ma'am, please calm down," Ms. Evans requested, trying to approach. "We need to talk about the children's situation." "I have nothing to talk about," the woman yelled, her voice filled with aggression. "They're my children, mine. No one is going to take them away from me." Her eyes finally focused on Richard, who remained firm in his protective position. "It was you, wasn't it? You're the one who stole my children." She lunged at him, her hands clawed like talons. "Ms. Miller!" Ms. Evans's firm voice made her stop. "How do you know your children are here? Who told you?" The woman hesitated for a moment, her expression faltering. I saw... Someone told me." She shook her head violently. "It doesn't matter. I came to get my children." "You abandoned a newborn baby in a hole," Richard said, keeping his voice controlled despite the anger he felt. "You left a 5-year-old girl alone for 3 days, trying to take care of her brother." "You don't know anything," Marilia screamed. "You don't know what I've been through. Samuel is better off without me. I just wanted... Her voice failed, and for a moment an expression of deep pain crossed her face. "Mommy." Tabitha's small voice made everyone turn. The girl was sitting up in bed, trembling, but there was something different in her eyes now, a mixture of fear and pity. "Why didn't you come back? You promised." Marilia staggered as if she had been slapped. I tried, honey, but they wouldn't let me. They said..." She stopped suddenly, her eyes taking on a frightening glint. "It doesn't matter. We're leaving now. Where's your brother? Where did you hide my baby?" "Samuel is in the ICU," informed the doctor who had just entered the room, drawn by the commotion. "He almost died of hypothermia and malnutrition. If he hadn't been found today..." "No!" Marilia covered her ears with her hands. "You're lying." "He's fine. I know he is. Tabitha took care of him, didn't she?" She looked at her daughter, pleading. "You took care of your little brother, didn't you, like I taught you?" Tabitha began to sob. "I tried, Mommy. I swear I tried. But it was so cold, and he cried so much." "Mom," Ms. Evans intervened again, "you need help. Let us help. Your children need medical care, and so do you." "I don't need help!" Marilia screamed, her voice rising several octaves. "I need my children. Don't you understand? They're the only thing I have left." At that moment, 2 hospital security guards appeared at the door. Marilia, upon seeing them, panicked. "No, I'm not going to let them take them again." She ran toward the bed, trying to grab Tabitha. Richard intercepted her, holding her arms. "Let me go! Let me go!" She struggled, screaming louder and louder. "Tabitha! Come with Mommy! Come!" The girl was paralyzed in bed, her small body shaking with sobs. It was then that Marilia managed to break free and in a quick movement grabbed Tabitha's arm, pulling her forcefully. The girl's cry of pain when the IV was ripped from her arm made Richard's blood run cold. Without thinking, he pushed Marilia away, picking up Tabitha in his arms. The girl clung to him, trembling violently. The security guards finally intervened, restraining Marilia, who continued screaming and struggling. The doctor quickly examined Tabitha's arm, which was bleeding where the needle had been torn out. "I'm going to call the police," one of the security guards said, but Ms. Evans stopped him. "No, what this woman needs is psychiatric care," she declared, before turning to Marilia, who was now crying uncontrollably. "Ms. Miller, I'm going to refer you for evaluation. You're clearly not in a condition to care for the children right now. No, please," Marilia sobbed, all the previous aggression replaced by a palpable despair. "They're my life. I can't lose them too." "No one is taking your children permanently," Ms. Evans explained firmly. "But you need to get treatment first, for their sake and for yours." While the social worker dealt with Marilia, Richard continued holding Tabitha, who refused to let go of his neck. He could feel her tears soaking his shirt. "She wasn't like this before," the girl whispered between sobs. "Mommy was different. She smiled, she sang to us, but after Daddy died..." Richard felt his heart clench even tighter. "What happened to your father, honey?" He worked driving a truck. Mommy said he fell asleep on the road." Tabitha tightened her hug. "After that, Mommy started crying a lot. Then she stopped crying and started getting angry. She started disappearing from home. Then came Samuel." The doctor approached again, a syringe in her hands. "She needs a mild sedative," she explained softly. "She's been through too much stress." Tabitha, upon seeing the needle, clung even tighter to Richard. "No, I don't want a shot. It's going to be okay," he assured her, stroking her hair. "It will help you rest a little. I promise I won't leave." The girl still resisted a little, but finally allowed the doctor to administer the medication, although she didn't let go of Richard at any moment. Gradually, her breathing calmed and her body relaxed in his arms. Even after she fell asleep, Richard continued holding her, sitting in the armchair next to the bed. Ms. Evans returned sometime later. "We managed to convince Ms. Miller to accept psychiatric admission," she informed him. "But we have a bigger problem now." "What?" Richard asked, although he already imagined the answer. "We need to decide who the children are going to stay with. Is there any family?" "There's only us," Tabitha murmured, who apparently wasn't completely asleep. "Grandma went to heaven last year. Grandpa was already there too." Richard looked at the social worker with determination. "I already said I can take care of them." "Mr. Harding, it's not that simple." "Why not? I have the financial means, space in my house, available time." "You have no family connection with the children. There's a whole legal process." "Then let's start that process now," he interrupted, "because I'm not going to allow these children to be thrown into a shelter after everything they've been through." Ms. Evans observed him for a long moment before sighing. "I'll see what I can do, but I need to warn you that it won't be easy. The mother, even with her problems, still has legal custody, and there's a lot of red tape involved." "I don't care," Richard declared. "I'll fight for them." At that moment, the doctor who was taking care of Samuel appeared at the door. Her face was grave. "The baby is getting worse," she informed them. "We need authorization from a responsible party for an emergency procedure." Richard felt Tabitha tense in his arms. The girl raised her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Samuel, he's going to be okay, isn't he?" she asked, her voice small and scared. Richard and the doctor exchanged a look. The fight for the lives of those children was just beginning. The neonatal ICU hallway seemed endless as Richard followed the doctor, carrying the sleeping Tabitha in his arms. The girl had flatly refused to stay in the room, even under the effect of the sedative. She needed to see her brother. Through the glass of the ICU, Samuel was fighting for his life, his tiny body connected to various machines. His skin, previously purpled with cold, was now yellowish, a sign that his liver wasn't functioning properly. "The situation is critical," the doctor explained in a low voice. "In addition to the initial hypothermia and severe malnutrition, he's developed a systemic infection, probably caused by the conditions he was in the hole." Richard felt Tabitha stir in his arms. She opened her eyes slowly, still drowsy from the medication, but when she saw her brother through the glass, she became instantly alert. "Why is he so yellow?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. "And why are there so many wires on him?" The doctor knelt down to get to her eye level. "Those are machines that are helping your little brother get strong again," she explained gently. "But he needs a special medicine, and we need authorization from a responsible adult for him to get that medicine." "But Mommy," Tabitha began, but her voice failed. Tears began to form in her eyes. "Your mother is receiving treatment now," Richard said softly. "She also needs help to get better." At that moment, Ms. Evans appeared in the hallway, accompanied by a middle-aged woman wearing a discreet suit. "This is Dr. Thompson from Child Protective Services," the social worker introduced. "She's going to help us with the situation." The CPS worker examined some documents in her folder before speaking. "Considering the emergency of the situation and the current state of the parent, we can issue a temporary authorization for the medical procedure," she declared. "As for temporary custody, I've already offered to take the children," Richard interrupted. Dr. Thompson observed him over her thin-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Harding, I understand your concern, but you need to understand that it's not that simple. You have no family connection with the children, no prior experience with parenthood." "But he saved us." Tabitha's voice, though weak, was filled with emotion. "He promised he would take care of us, and he didn't lie. Not like—" She didn't complete the sentence, but everyone understood what she meant. The CPS worker sighed, looking again at her papers. "There's also the matter of your professional life, Mr. Harding. You're a busy businessman. How do you intend to reconcile that with the care that two vulnerable children need?" "I can work from home," he replied. "Readily. I have a competent team that can take on more responsibilities. Money is no problem. I can hire all the help I need. It's not just a financial matter," Dr. Thompson argued. "These children need emotional stability, attention. They need—" She was interrupted by an alarm coming from the ICU. The doctor ran inside immediately, and everyone watched tensely as the team moved quickly around Samuel's crib. "What's happening?" Tabitha asked, panicked. "What are they doing to him?" Richard hugged her tighter, his own heart racing. "The doctors are taking care of him, honey. It's going to be okay." After what seemed like an eternity, the doctor came out of the ICU. Her face was grave. "His condition has worsened," she informed them. "We need to do the procedure now, or we may lose him." Dr. Thompson didn't hesitate any longer. She took a form from her folder and filled it out quickly. "Here's the emergency authorization," she said, handing the document to the doctor. "Do what's necessary." While the medical team prepared for the procedure, Tabitha began to cry softly on Richard's shoulder. "I don't want him to die," she sobbed. "I promised Mommy I would take care of him." "Hey, look at me," Richard asked, turning her gently so that he could see her eyes. "You did an incredible job taking care of Samuel. You stayed with him in the cold. You protected him from everything you could. But now you don't have to do it alone. There are people here to help you both." The girl sniffled, wiping her nose on the sleeve of her hospital gown. "Promise you won't leave. Everyone leaves." Those words hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. He looked at the CPS worker, who was observing the scene with a softer expression. "Dr. Thompson," he called, "I know it's not the normal procedure, But these children have been abandoned too many times. I can't promise Tabitha that I'll stay if I'm not sure I'll be allowed to. So please, tell me what I need to do to get temporary custody of them." The CPS worker hesitated for a moment, but then took a card from her pocket. "This is the contact information for Dr. Miller, one of the best family law attorneys I know. Contact him first thing tomorrow." Richard took the card, feeling a pang of hope. But before he could thank her, another alarm sounded in the ICU. This time, several professionals ran inside. The movement was even more intense than before, and the expressions were more urgent. "He's very pale," Tabitha observed, her voice trembling. "Why is he like that?" The doctor quickly left the ICU, dressing in a special procedure gown. "The baby is going into shock. Septic shock," she said hurriedly. "We're going to have to take him into surgery immediately." "Surgery?" Tabitha's voice rose several octaves. "No, he's too little." "It's his only chance, honey," the doctor said, gently. "I promise we'll do everything we can." As the team prepared Samuel for transport, Tabitha squirmed in Richard's arms, wanting to get down. When he put her on the floor, she ran to the ICU glass, placing her small hand against it. "Sammy," she called softly, using a nickname that Richard hadn't heard before. "You need to be strong, okay? Tata's here. I won't leave you alone, I promise." The team began to move the special crib toward the elevator. Tabitha followed with her eyes, her legs trembling so much that Richard was afraid she would fall. He picked her up again just in time. As soon as the elevator doors closed, taking Samuel away, she burst into sobs. "What if he doesn't come back?" she asked through tears. "What if he goes to heaven like Daddy?" "Don't think about that now," Richard pleaded, trying to keep his voice steady despite his own fear. "Let's pray for him, okay? Do you know how to pray?" Tabitha nodded. "Grandma taught me the Lord's Prayer before she went to heaven. Then let's pray together," he suggested, taking her back to the room. She agreed, nestling in his lap when he sat down in the armchair. As Tabitha's small, trembling voice recited the prayer that her grandmother had taught her, Richard made his own silent plea. He couldn't bear the idea that that child, who had already lost so much in her short life, could also lose the brother she had tried so hard to protect. The next few hours were the longest of his life. Tabitha refused to sleep, fighting against exhaustion with all the strength she had. Every time someone passed by the door, she jumped, hoping for news. "How long will it take?" she asked for the 10th time, her voice hoarse from crying. "Surgeries sometimes take a long time," Richard explained patiently. "The doctors need to be very careful, especially with a small baby like Samuel." But inside he was also growing more and more apprehensive. It had been 4 hours since they took the baby, and no news. That's when they heard footsteps in the hallway. The doctor entered the room, and Richard felt his heart stop when he saw her expression. The doctor looked exhausted, with blood stains on her surgical gown. Richard felt Tabitha hold her breath in his arms. "Samuel survived the surgery," the doctor announced, and a collective sigh of relief echoed through the room. "But," she continued, and Richard felt his heart clench again at that single word, "the next 48 hours will be crucial. His condition is still very serious, but he's going to be okay, right?" Tabitha asked, her voice small and scared. "He's strong. I know he is." The doctor approached, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Your little brother is very strong indeed. Tabitha, he's fighting bravely, but I need to be honest with you. He's still very sick." Tabitha began to tremble in Richard's arms. "I want to see him," she asked, already starting to struggle. "I need to see him now." "Calm down, honey," Richard held her gently. "Samuel needs to rest after the surgery, and you need to rest too." "No!" She struggled even harder. "I can't sleep. What if he needs me? What if he's scared alone?" The doctor intervened gently. He's not alone, honey. There's an entire team taking care of him 24 hours a day. And as soon as he's a little more stable, you'll be able to see him, I promise." But Tabitha wasn't convinced. Thick tears began to stream down her face, already marked by crying. "You don't understand. I promised him. I promised that I wouldn't let anything bad happen." "And you kept your promise," Richard said, turning her in his lap so that she could look into his eyes. "You protected him for 3 days alone, in the cold, without food. You did more than any child your age could do. Now you need to trust the doctors to help him get better." The girl sobbed, burying her face in Richard's chest. "But I'm so scared. Everyone leaves. Daddy left, Grandma left, Mommy, and now Sammy." "Hey, look at me," Richard asked, gently lifting her chin. "Samuel is not leaving. He's fighting to stay with you, and I'm not leaving either." "Promise?" she asked, her big eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I promise. And I always keep my promises, don't I?" She nodded slowly, remembering how he had kept every promise he had made since they met him. The doctor took advantage of the moment to approach with a syringe. "Tabitha, you need to rest. I'm going to give you some medicine to help you sleep a little, okay?" This time, surprisingly, the girl didn't protest. She just clung tighter to Richard as the doctor administered the medication. "Don't let go of my hand," she asked, her voice already starting to get drowsy. "I won't let go," he assured her, making her more comfortable in his lap. As Tabitha finally succumbed to sleep, Ms. Evans entered the room. Her face showed clear signs of fatigue, but there was also a determination in her eyes. "Mr. Harding," she called in a low voice so as not to wake Tabitha, "we need to talk about some developments." Richard nodded but made no mention of moving. He wouldn't break his promise not to let go of Tabitha's hand. "Ms. Miller," Ms. Evans continued, sitting in a nearby chair, "is hospitalized in the psychiatric ward. Her condition is complicated. Apparently, after her husband's death, she entered a spiral of depression that was never treated properly." "And what happened after that?" Richard asked, although he feared the answer. "She started drinking, then moved on to harder drugs. She became pregnant with Samuel during that period. She didn't have any prenatal care, and from what the doctors indicated, the delivery happened in precarious conditions." Richard felt his stomach turn. How did someone not notice? How did no one help? The neighbors reported that she completely isolated herself in recent months. Tabitha stopped going to school. We discovered that she was enrolled in kindergarten, but dropped out in the middle of the year. People saw that something was wrong, but no one did anything, Richard finished, the bitterness evident in his voice. The social worker in the neighborhood tried to make some visits, but Ms. Miller never answered. Without a formal complaint, there wasn't much that could be done. At that moment, Dr. Thompson also entered the room, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Mr. Harding," she began in a professional tone, "considering the gravity of the situation and the state of the parent, I managed to get a temporary court order for you to assume temporary responsibility for the children." Richard's heart leaped. "Does this mean that you can make the necessary medical decisions and keep the children in your custody while the process runs its course? But," she emphasized the word, "this is only temporary. For permanent custody, the road will be much more complex." "I don't care about the complexity," he replied firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes." "You need to understand," the CPS worker continued, "that even with all the problems, Ms. Miller is still their mother. If she recovers and demonstrates that she's fit, she'll have priority in the custody case." Richard was about to respond, but was interrupted by a movement in his lap. Tabitha stirred, mumbling something in her sleep. Her small hands gripped his shirt tighter. "No, don't take him, please," she mumbled, clearly having a nightmare. "Shh, it's okay," Richard whispered, stroking her hair. "You're safe. Samuel is safe." She calmed down under his touch, returning to a more peaceful sleep. Dr. Thompson observed the scene with interest. "You already have a strong bond with her," she commented. "That will be important in the process." Before they could continue the conversation, the doctor returned to the room in a hurry. "Mr. Harding," she called, her voice tense, "we need you in the ICU. Now." Richard felt his blood run cold. Carefully, so as not to wake Tabitha, he transferred her to the bed. The girl grumbled a little but didn't wake up. The medication kept her in a deep sleep. "What happened?" he asked as he followed the doctor down the hallway. "Samuel is having another crisis. We need authorization for another emergency procedure." When they arrived at the ICU, Richard saw through the glass window the medical team moving frantically around the crib. Samuel's tiny body was even paler than before, and the machines were emitting various alarms. "He's having an internal hemorrhage," the doctor explained quickly. "We need to take him back to surgery immediately." Richard signed the authorization with trembling hands. As he watched the team prepare the baby for another surgery, a silent prayer escaped his lips. "Please," he murmured, "don't let this girl lose anyone else." Across the hall, a passing nurse suddenly stopped, looking into Tabitha's room. Richard followed her gaze and felt his heart stop. The bed was empty. A chilling panic gripped Richard when he saw the empty bed. The sheet was thrown haphazardly, and the IV that should have been connected to Tabitha's arm hung loose beside the bed. How had she managed to get out without anyone noticing? "We need to find her," he said to the nurse. "She's under the effect of sedatives. She could get hurt." The news of the missing girl spread quickly throughout the hospital. Employees began searching every floor, hallway and room. Richard felt his heart pounding faster and faster, divided between worry for Tabitha and anguish for Samuel, who was being rushed into another surgery. "Mr. Harding," Ms. Evans called, "you know Tabitha better than anyone here. Where do you think she might have gone?" Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think like the girl. Even sedated, even exhausted, what would be the first thing she would do upon waking? The answer came like a flash. "The chapel!" he exclaimed. "Earlier, when we were praying, she asked if there was a chapel in the hospital. One of the nurses said it was on the ground floor." Without waiting for a response, he ran toward the stairs. The elevator would take too long, and every second was precious. He descended the steps 2 at a time, his heart hammering in his chest, praying that he was right. The hospital chapel was a small, simple space, lit only by a few candles and the faint light that entered through a stained glass window. There, kneeling in one of the front pews, was Tabitha. Her small body was trembling, and she was murmuring something that Richard couldn't understand. He approached slowly, trying not to scare her. When he got closer, he could hear what she was saying. "Please, God, don't take Sammy," she begged through sobs. "You already took Daddy and Grandma. Mommy left too. I promise I'll be good. I promise I'll take care of him right. But don't let him go too." Richard felt tears forming in his own eyes. He knelt beside her, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. Tabitha wasn't startled by his touch. It was as if she already knew that he would find her. "How did you get here, honey?" he asked softly. I woke up and remembered Sammy," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "Grandma always said that when we're scared, we have to pray. So I took the thing out of my arm and came, but it was hard to walk. Everything was spinning." Richard then noticed how pale she was, how her body swayed, even sitting down. The effects of the sedative were still strong. "You could have gotten hurt," he said, pulling her closer. "Why didn't you call me?" "You were busy helping Sammy," she replied, resting her head on his chest. "And I needed to talk to God alone. I needed to explain to him that Sammy is too little to go to heaven." The simplicity and depth of that explanation hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. How many times had that child needed to deal alone with things that no child should face? No, he began, choosing his words carefully. "We can pray together. You don't have to carry that weight alone." Tabitha looked up at him, and there was something different in her gaze, a mixture of surprise and hope. "You pray too?" she asked. "Sometimes we only remember to pray when we're very scared," he admitted, "like now." The girl nodded, perfectly understanding what he meant. "Are you scared for Sammy too?" "I am," he answered honestly. "And I'm scared for you too. When I saw that you were gone." "Sorry," she murmured, lowering her eyes. "I didn't want to make you worried. It's just that sometimes it feels like if I don't do something, everything will fall apart again. Like when Mummy started to get different." Richard hugged her, tighter, feeling how her small body was still trembling. "Tabitha, look at me," he asked. When she raised her face, he continued, "You don't have to be the adult anymore. You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders anymore. Now there are people to take care of you and Samuel. But what if—" she hesitated, biting her lip. "What if what, honey? What if you get tired too? Mummy said she was going to get better, that she was going to stop drinking that stuff that made her weird, but she never stopped, and then she would disappear, sometimes for days." The pain in that childish voice was almost unbearable to hear. Richard cupped her face in his hands, looking into her big, scared eyes. "I'm not your mother, Tabitha. I can't promise that I'll fix everything, because some things don't have an easy fix, but I can promise that I won't give up. I won't get tired. I won't disappear." "Even if I'm a lot of trouble?" she asked in a whisper. "Even if you're all the trouble in the world, even if I cry a lot, even if you cry a whole ocean, even if—" She stopped sobbing. "Even if Sammy doesn't—" "Hey," he interrupted gently, "we're not going to think about that now. Your brother is strong, just like you. He's fighting, and there are a lot of people helping him in that fight." Tabitha nodded, but Richard could see that she was struggling to keep her eyes open. The sedative was kicking back in with full force. "Let's go back to the room," he suggested. "You need to rest. But what about Sammy?" "As soon as we have news about the surgery, I'll wake you up, I promise." She reluctantly agreed, allowing him to pick her up. Her body was limp with exhaustion, and even before they reached the door of the chapel, she had fallen asleep. In the hallway, they found Ms. Evans and the nursing staff, all visibly relieved to see Tabitha safe. "We need to put the IV back in," said one of the nurses, "and this time we'll have to restrain her arm to the bed to prevent her from pulling it out again." "No," Richard replied firmly. "She's been through enough confinement. I'll stay with her. I won't let her get up again." The nurse seemed ready to argue, but something in his expression made her change her mind. Maybe she realized that that wasn't just an empty promise. It was a commitment that came from the bottom of his soul. Back in the room, after the IV was reconnected and Tabitha was settled comfortably in bed, Ms. Evans approached Richard. "You have a natural gift with her," commented the social worker. "It's like—" She was interrupted by a commotion at the door. The doctor who was with Samuel had returned. Her face was grave, and Richard felt his heart clench. "How is he?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The doctor took a deep breath before answering, and that small hesitation made Richard feel like the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. The doctor entered the room, closing the door softly behind her. Her face was marked by the fatigue of hours of surgery, and there were bloodstains on her gown that she hadn't even had time to change. "We managed to stop the bleeding," she began, and Richard released the air he hadn't even realized he was holding. But something in her expression said there was more. "However, the situation is still extremely delicate. During the surgery, we discovered that there's a much more serious infection than we initially imagined." Richard sat down heavily in the chair next to Tabitha's bed, who was still sleeping, oblivious to the severity of the news about her brother. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "His body is too weak to fight the infection on its own," the doctor explained. We're going to start a new protocol of antibiotics, but—" She hesitated, glancing briefly at Tabitha before continuing in a lower voice. "I need to be honest with you. The odds aren't good." The room seemed to spin for a moment. Richard looked at the sleeping girl, her little face still marked by tears, and felt a tightness in his chest that almost prevented him from breathing. How could he tell her? How could he explain that after everything she had done to protect her brother, she could still lose him? "How long?" he managed to ask. "The next 12 hours will be crucial," the doctor replied. "If he survives the night, his chances increase. But I need to warn you that even then, the situation is very serious." At that moment, Tabitha stirred in bed, mumbling something in her sleep. Everyone froze, fearing that she would wake up and hear the conversation. But she just turned to the other side, still under the effect of the sedatives. "Is there anything we can do?" Richard asked, his voice almost pleading. The doctor hesitated, again before answering. "There's an experimental drug that could help. It's a last-resort antibiotic, specially developed for severe cases like his. But it's extremely expensive and not covered by any insurance. Also, we would need special authorization from the FDA to import it, and time is something we don't have much of." "How much?" Richard asked immediately. The doctor wrote a number on a piece of paper and handed it to him. Richard looked at the digits and didn't hesitate for a second. "Do what needs to be done," he said, already grabbing his phone. "I'll make the transfer right now. And what about the authorization?" "I have some contacts at the FDA," Ms. Evans intervened, who had remained silent until then. "I can try to speed up the process. I can't guarantee anything, but—" "Please," Richard asked, "any help is welcome." While the social worker left to make some calls, the doctor approached Richard again. "Mr. Harding," she began in a professional tone, "I need to warn you that even with the medication, there are no guarantees. Samuel's condition is very serious, and considering that he was already born premature, in precarious conditions—" "Doctor," Richard interrupted, "that girl they spent 3 days alone in the cold, trying to keep her brother alive. She didn't give up on him. I'm not going to give up either." The doctor nodded, a small smile appearing on her tired face. "I'll prepare everything for when the medication arrives. In the meantime, we'll continue with the current treatment." After she left, Richard turned his attention to Tabitha. Her sleep now seemed more peaceful, and he thanked silently for that. She would need all her strength to face what was to come. The next few hours were torture. Every time an alarm sounded in the ICU, Richard felt his heart stop. Every time a doctor or nurse hurried past the hallway, he feared that it was bad news. Miss Evans returned around 3 in the morning, looking exhausted but satisfied. "I got the emergency authorization," she informed him. "The medication should arrive in a few hours." "Thank you," Richard said sincerely. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you're doing." "You don't need to thank me," she replied, sitting next to him. "You know, in all my years as a social worker, I've seen many difficult cases. I've seen people who promised to help and gave up at the first obstacle. But you're different." Richard didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on Tabitha. "You know what's strangest?" he said finally. "Until yesterday, my biggest worry was a business deal that went wrong. I thought my life was a mess because of that. Then I found these kids and—" He shook his head as if he still couldn't believe everything that had happened. "And discovered that some things are more important than business?" Ms. Evans completed with a small smile. "I discovered that I was living an empty life," he corrected. "All the money in the world means nothing if you don't have something really important to fight for." They were interrupted by a movement on the bed. Tabitha was waking up, her eyes opening slowly, still heavy with the medication. "Richard?" she called in a low voice. "I'm here, honey," he replied, holding her hand. "Sammy, how is he?" Richard exchanged a quick look with Miss Evans before answering. "He's fighting, Tabitha. The doctors are doing everything they can to help him." "Can I see him?" she asked, trying to sit up. "Not now, honey," he replied gently, helping her to settle better on the pillows. "He needs to rest, and so do you." "But what if he needs me?" "He knows you're here. He knows you won't abandon him. But now, you need to trust the doctors, remember?" Tabitha nodded, although Richard could see that she was fighting against sleep. "Again. You promise you'll wake me up if anything happens?" "I promise," he replied, stroking her hair. "Now rest a little more." She closed her eyes, but her hand continued holding Richard's tightly. Even almost asleep, she didn't want to lose that connection. That's when they heard a commotion in the hallway, raised voices, hurried footsteps. Richard felt his heart race when he recognized Samuel's doctor's voice giving urgent orders. "We need him in the ICU now," she was shouting. "He's having a cardiac arrest." Tabitha, who was almost asleep, opened her eyes suddenly. "What was that?" she asked, the fear evident in her voice. Before Richard could answer, the door to the room opened. Violently. It was a nurse, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Harding," she called urgently, "you need to come now. Samuel." Richard had never felt so torn in his life. He knew he needed to go, but he couldn't leave Tabitha alone. Not after promising that he would stay with her. It was Miss Evans who resolved his dilemma. "Go," she said, taking his place next to Tabitha. "I'll stay with her." But when Richard tried to let go of Tabitha's hand, she squeezed it tighter. "Don't go," she pleaded in a terrified whisper. "Please don't leave me alone." "Tabitha, look at me," he asked, kneeling beside the bed. "Your brother needs me now. Miss Evans will stay with you, and I'll be back as soon as I can. I promise." The girl looked at him, then at Miss Evans, and finally released his hand. But before Richard could walk away, she said something that made his heart break into 1,000 pieces. "Tell Sammy that I love him," she asked in a low voice, in case he needs to go to heaven like Daddy." The ICU hallway had never seemed so long to Richard. Tabitha's words echoed in his mind as he ran, following the nurse. When he reached the neonatal unit, the scene he found made his blood run cold. An entire team of doctors and nurses surrounded Samuel's small crib. The baby's tiny body seemed even smaller amid so many machines and professionals. The doctor was applying chest compressions with controlled delicacy, trying to revive that heart that kept threatening to stop. "Another dose of epinephrine," she ordered without interrupting the compressions. "And someone locate that medication. We can't waste any more time." "The medication is already on its way," Richard informed, his voice trembling. "It should arrive in a few hours." "He needs to hold on until then," the doctor replied, sweat dripping from her forehead as she continued the procedure. "Come on, little guy, fight!" The next few minutes were an eternity. Richard watched, helpless, as the team fought to keep Samuel alive. Every second that the monitor showed a flat line seemed to last a lifetime. "I got a pulse!" one of the nurses finally announced. The sound of the heartbeat, although weak, filled the room, and everyone released the breath they were holding. "He's very unstable," the doctor explained, checking the vital signs. "The infection is spreading faster than we can control. Without that medication—" She was interrupted by a commotion at the door of the ICU. A nurse ran in, carrying a small cooler. "The medication has arrived," she announced. "The helicopter just landed on the roof." The doctor didn't waste any time. She prepared the medication with a speed that only years of experience provide, and soon the experimental antibiotic was running through Samuel's veins through the intravenous access. "Now we wait," she said, finally allowing herself to sit down for a moment. "The next few hours will be decisive," Richard watched the baby through the glass of the heated crib. Samuel was so pale that his skin seemed almost transparent. Tubes and wires connected to his body on all sides, and yet, amid all that medical apparatus, Richard could see his fight for life. "He's a warrior," commented the doctor, noticing his gaze. "Most babies wouldn't have lasted this long in the conditions he was in." "Like his sister," Richard replied, thinking of Tabitha. "She's a warrior too." As if summoned by his thoughts, a scream echoed through the hallway. Richard's heart leaped. He knew that voice. "Sammy!" Tabitha was shouting. "Let me see my brother!" Richard ran out of the ICU, finding Tabitha in the hallway. She had ripped the IV out again and managed to escape from Ms. Evans, who was coming right behind, trying to catch her. "Tabitha, wait!" he called, but the girl had already reached the window of the ICU. When her eyes met her brother's, she froze. Why is he like that?" she asked in a whisper, her small hands pressed against the glass. "Why are there so many wires on him?" Richard knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Those are the machines that are helping him get better, remember? And look, a special medicine has just arrived that will help even more." Tabitha didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on her brother, studying every detail of his state. "Is he breathing?" she asked finally, her voice so low that Richard could barely hear. "He is," he replied. "See that monitor over there? Each beep is a beat of his heart." Tabitha was silent, counting the beeps. "It's too slow," she said after a moment. "Is his heart tired?" The question caught Richard by surprise. How could such a small child have such keen perception? "He's fighting, honey," he replied sincerely. "He's giving it his best." "Like I did?" she asked, turning to look at Richard. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of guilt and fear that broke his heart. "You've done more than anyone could expect," he assured, pulling her into a hug. "Without you, Samuel wouldn't even have made it this far." Tabitha buried her face in his chest, but didn't cry. It was as if her tears had dried up, as if she had reached a point beyond crying. "Can I tell you a secret?" she asked after a moment. "Of course you can. Sometimes I dream that everything is different, that Mommy is still how she used to be, smiling and singing to us, that Daddy didn't go to heaven, that Sammy was born in a nice hospital, not in that dark and cold place." Her voice faltered a little. "Is it wrong to dream like that?" Richard felt his own tears threatening to fall. "No, honey, it's not wrong to dream about good things. But it hurts," she confessed. "It hurts a lot when I wake up and see that it's not true." Before Richard could answer, an alarm sounded inside the ICU. Samuel's heart monitor showed worrying changes. The doctor and the nursing staff rushed to the crib. Tabitha straightened up in Richard's arms, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. The doctor was checking Samuel's vital signs, her face tense. "His pressure is dropping," she informed the team. "We need more support." "Isn't the new medicine working?" Tabitha asked, surprising everyone. No one expected her to understand so much about the situation. "It's still too early for the medication to take effect," the doctor explained gently, without stopping her activities. "We need to give it some time." Tabitha nodded, as if she understood perfectly. Then, to everyone's amazement, she began to sing. It was a soft melody, almost a lullaby. "It's the song that Mommy used to sing to us," she explained when she noticed the surprised looks. Before she got sick, she always said that music helps to heal the heart. The medical team worked to the sound of that children's song, fighting to stabilize Samuel. Gradually, the alarms went silent and the numbers on the monitors began to improve. "It worked," Tabitha whispered, a small smile appearing on her face for the first time in a long time. He heard the music. At that moment, watching Tabitha. Singing to her brother through the glass of the ICU, Richard felt something change inside him, a certainty that had been forming little by little, but that was now clear as crystal. No matter what happened, those children were already his family. But fate still had more trials in store for them. Little did they know that the worst was yet to come. The door to the ICU opened violently, and a nurse ran in. "Doctor," she called, breathless. "The children's mother. She escaped from the psychiatric ward." Chaos broke out immediately after the announcement of Ms. Miller's escape. Security guards were alerted, the hospital doors began to be monitored, and an intense search began on every floor. Richard felt Tabitha stiffen in. His arms, the girl's face, which moments before showed a slight smile while singing to her brother, was now as pale as paper. "She's going to take us away," Tabitha whispered, clinging tighter to Richard, like last time. "She's not," he assured, although his own heart was racing. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Samuel's doctor quickly organized extra security for the neonatal ICU. "No one enters here without authorization," she ordered, "and I want 2 security guards at this door at all times." Ms. Evans, who had arrived shortly after the announcement of the escape, pulled Richard aside, speaking in a low voice so that Tabitha wouldn't hear. "The situation is more serious than we imagined," she informed him. "Ms. Miller assaulted 2 nurses during the escape. She's completely out of control." "How did she manage to escape?" Richard asked, keeping a protective arm around Tabitha. "Apparently she had hidden some pills under her tongue, pretending to take the medication. When the effect of the sedation wore off, she waited for the right moment and attacked." Richard looked at Tabitha, who remained clinging to him as if her life depended on it. The girl seemed to be in another world, her eyes fixed on a distant point, as if she were reliving memories she preferred to forget. "Tabitha," he called softly, "what happened the last time you talked about, when you said your mother took you away?" The girl trembled visibly before answering. It was when the lady from CPS came to the house," she began, her voice almost a whisper. "She said that we couldn't be alone, that we needed help. Mommy got very angry, shouted a lot. After the lady left, she made us pack a backpack in a hurry and ran away, with us in the middle of the night." "Where did you go?" Miss Evans asked gently. "To the house of a man I didn't know. It was a dirty place. There were more people there. Everyone drank like Mommy." Tabitha shuddered at the memory. "We stayed there hidden until Sammy was born. It was there that—" She stopped, her small hands gripping Richard's shirt tightly. "That what, honey?" he prompted. "It was there that Mommy started to say that Sammy was cursed, that he had brought all the bad luck into her life. She didn't let anyone hold him. She said he was going to pass on the curse." Silent tears began to stream down Tabitha's face. Then one night she disappeared with him. When she came back, she said she had left him in a place where good people would find and take care of him. But I followed her. I saw where she had put him. Richard felt his heart clench even tighter. That child had been through so much, seen so much. How could someone so small carry such a heavy burden? At that moment they heard shouts coming. From the hallway, the voice was unmistakable. "Where are my children?" Ms. Miller was yelling. "I know you hid them. Give me back my children." Tabitha began to tremble violently. Richard picked her up and quickly entered the ICU with her, closing the door. The security guards positioned themselves outside. "She's going to find us," Tabitha murmured, burying her face in Richard's neck. "She always finds us." Samuel's doctor approached quickly. "Come with me," she said, guiding them to a small room attached to the ICU. "You're safer here." They had barely entered the room when they heard a crash coming from the hallway, followed by more shouts and sounds of fighting. Tabitha shrank even further into Richard's arms. "Don't let her take us," the girl begged. "Please don't let her hurt Sammy again." "I won't let her," he promised, although his heart was racing. "No one is going to hurt you." Ms. Miller's screams were getting closer and closer. Through the small window of the room, they could see the movement in the hallway. Security guards running, nurses trying to restrain the situation. "I know they're here!" Ms. Miller was yelling. "I can feel it! They're my children! Mine!" Richard could feel Tabitha's heart beating fast against his chest. The girl was trembling so much that her teeth began to chatter. "It's okay, honey," he whispered, stroking her hair. "Breathe deep with me." But before they could do anything, the door to the ICU burst open. Ms. Miller had managed to get past the security guards. Her face was twisted into a mask of fury and despair, her eyes glazed and unsteady. "I knew it," she shouted upon seeing Tabitha in Richard's arms. "I knew you had stolen my children. Give them back. Give them back now." She lunged towards them, but the doctor placed herself in her path. "Ms. Miller, you're not well. You need to go back to—" "Shut up!" Ms. Miller bellowed, shoving the doctor hard. "You don't understand. They're mine, mine. No one is going to take them away from me." Her eyes found Samuel's crib through the glass of the ICU, and something in her expression changed. A disturbing smile formed on her lips. "Ah, there you are," she said in a strangely sweet voice. "The little cursed one. You shouldn't have survived. Good people were supposed to find you, you know, people who could break the curse. But no, you had to survive. You had to keep ruining my life." "Stop it!" Tabitha suddenly shouted, her voice filled with a force that no one expected. "Sammy is not cursed. He's just a baby that you abandoned in a cold hole." Ms. Miller seemed shocked for a moment by her daughter's outburst, but soon her face twisted again in fury. "You don't understand," she screamed, advancing. "None of you understand. Ever since he was born, everything has gone wrong. Everything. But I'm going to fix this. I'm going to fix everything." She began to move towards Samuel's crib, her intentions clear in her insane eyes. Richard quickly placed Tabitha behind him, protecting her with his body. "Not another step," he warned, his voice firmer than it had ever been. But Ms. Miller wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on Samuel, and she continued mumbling about curses and how she needed to fix everything. That's when Samuel's monitors began to beep. The baby, as if sensing the danger, began to have changes in his vital signs. "He's destabilizing," the doctor alerted, running to the crib. "We need help here." The chaos that followed seemed to happen in slow motion. Ms. Miller tried to take advantage of the confusion to get to Samuel, but Richard stopped her. In the struggle that followed, equipment was knocked over, and the monitor alarms became even more frantic. And then, amid all that chaos, a small voice rose, beginning to sing. It was Tabitha, humming again the lullaby that her mother used to sing before everything went wrong. The effect was immediate and astonishing. Ms. Miller stopped fighting, her eyes widening as she recognized the melody. For a moment, a brief moment, something seemed to change in her gaze. The madness gave way to a painful lucidity. "That song," she murmured, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I used to—" But before she could complete the sentence, the security guards finally managed to enter the ICU, immobilizing her. A nurse quickly administered a sedative, and Ms. Miller was restrained. As they led her away, she continued mumbling. But now, her voice was different, broken, lost. "My babies. What have I done to my babies?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the beeps of Samuel's monitors, which gradually began to normalize. Tabitha, still singing softly, approached. Her brother's crib. Her small hands trembled as they touched the glass. "Sorry, Sammy," she whispered between the verses of the song. "Mommy didn't mean it. She's sick. She's not herself anymore." Richard approached from behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. Tabitha turned and hugged him tightly, finally allowing herself to cry, not the desperate cry from before, but a different cry, almost like a lament for everything she had lost. That's when they noticed that something was different. The sound of the monitors had changed. The change in the sound of the monitors made everyone freeze. The doctor ran to Samuel's crib, quickly checking the devices and the baby's vital signs. Her face, initially tense, began to show signs of surprise. "This is, extraordinary," she murmured, checking the data again. "What is it?" Richard asked, his heart racing. "Is something wrong?" "No," the doctor replied, a small smile forming on her lips. "On the contrary, his vital signs are more stable than at any point since he arrived here. It's like—" She stopped, looking at Tabitha, who was still hugging Richard. "Like the music really helped." Tabitha gently disengaged from Richard's arms and approached the crib. "Can I sing more?" she asked shyly. "Grandma always said that when we sing, the angels sing along." The doctor nodded, touched. "Of course you can, honey." And so, in that ICU that moments before had been the scene of so much chaos and despair, Tabitha's soft voice rose again. The music, a simple lullaby, seemed to have the power to calm not only Samuel but everyone present. While the girls sang, the medical team worked silently, reorganizing the equipment that had been knocked over during the commotion. Richard watched, marveling, as the numbers on the monitors continued to improve. "The new medicine must be starting to take effect," the doctor commented in a low voice, so as not to interrupt Tabitha's song. "But there's something more happening here. It's as if he's responding to her voice." "They have a special connection," Richard said, remembering how Tabitha had taken care of her brother alone for so long. "She's more than a sister to him. She's practically a mother." The doctor nodded, making some notes on her clipboard. "You know," she began, hesitant, "there are studies about the power of the human voice in the recovery of patients, especially babies. But what we're seeing here is something unique." At that moment, Ms. Evans entered the ICU silently. Her face showed signs of fatigue, but there was an air of determination in her eyes. "Ms. Miller is sedated," she informed in a low voice. "She's been transferred to a high-security psychiatric unit. This time, there's no chance of escape." "How is she?" Richard asked, surprising everyone with his concern. "When the sedative started to take effect, she changed," Ms. Evans responded. "She started to cry, begging for forgiveness. It's as if, for a brief moment, she had realized everything she had done." She paused before continuing. "The doctors think that the episode may have been a trigger for her to start to process reality." Richard looked at Tabitha, who continued singing softly to her brother, seemingly oblivious to the adults' conversation. But something in her posture said she was hearing every word. "What happens now?" he asked. "The judge has already been informed of the incident," Ms. Evans replied. "Considering the severity of the situation, he's going to move the temporary custody hearing to tomorrow." Richard's heart leaped. "That soon?" "It's an emergency case," she explained. "After what happened today, it became clear that these children need immediate protection." That's when they noticed that Tabitha had stopped singing. The girl was standing next to the crib, her small hands resting on the glass, staring at her brother. "He's smiling," she said suddenly. Everyone approached. The crib. In fact, even with all the tubes and machines, it was possible to see a small movement in Samuel's lips that resembled a smile. "Babies of this age don't smile consciously yet," the doctor explained gently. "It's probably a reflex." "No," Tabitha interrupted with surprising certainty. "He's really smiling. He always made that face when I sang to him, back in the hole. Even when it was very cold, even when he was hungry, he smiled at me." The doctor was going to say something, but changed her mind. There were things that science couldn't explain, and the bond between those siblings was one of them. "Will Sammy be able to go home with us?" Tabitha suddenly asked. turning to Richard. The us in her question made his heart clench with emotion. "When he's better, honey," he replied. "First, he needs to get strong." "And Mommy?" she asked, in a low voice. "Is she going to get better too?" Richard knelt down to get to her level. "Your mother is sick, Tabitha. Not the kind of sickness that we see, like a cold or a tummy ache. It's a sickness here." He touched his own temple lightly. "And here," he moved his hand to his heart. "She needs a lot of treatment to get better. And until then," her voice was almost a whisper, "until then, if the judge allows it, you stay with me, and I promise I'll take care of both of you with all the love in the world." Tabitha hugged him tightly, burying her face in his neck. "You promise you won't get sick like Mommy? You promise you won't change?" "I promise, honey. I promise I'll always be here for you just the way I am." The moment was interrupted by a sound from the monitors, but this time it wasn't an alarm. It was the sound of Samuel's breathing, stronger and more regular than before. "The antibiotic is working better than expected," the doctor informed, checking the data. "The infection is starting to subside." "Does that mean he's going to be okay?" Tabitha asked, hope shining in her eyes. "We still have a long way to go," the doctor replied honestly. "But for the first time since he arrived here, I can say that I'm really optimistic." Tabitha smiled, a small but genuine smile, the first since that whole saga had begun. She turned her attention back to her brother and began to sing again, as if she wanted to ensure that he continued to improve. Richard watched the scene with his heart full of love and determination. Tomorrow would be a decisive day. The hearing would determine whether or not he could keep his promise to take care of those children. But something inside him said that everything would be all right. That's when his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from his attorney. "We need to talk urgently. I discovered something about Ms. Miller's past that could complicate everything." Fear returned to clench his chest. What else did that story hold? The attorney's office was in an old building in the city center. Richard was only able to leave the hospital after Tabitha finally fell asleep, exhausted after the events of the day. Ms. Evans promised to stay with her, and the doctor assured him that she would notify him immediately if there was any change. In Samuel's condition, Dr. Miller, the attorney recommended by Ms. Evans, was waiting for him with a grave expression. On his desk was a pile of documents that he had clearly spent hours analyzing. "Mr. Harding," he began as soon as Richard sat down, "what we discovered is concerning. I've been investigating Ms. Miller's history and found something that could seriously affect your chances of getting custody of the children." Richard felt his stomach sink. "What did you find?" The attorney picked up a folder and opened it carefully. "Ms. Miller has another child." The revelation hit Richard like a punch. "What do you mean, another child?" "A boy, born 10 years ago," Dr. Miller explained. "He was given up for adoption under questionable circumstances. The adoptive family filed a lawsuit at the time, claiming that Ms. Miller had tried to extort them after the adoption." "My God," Richard murmured, running his hands over his face. "Does Tabitha know about this?" "We believe not. She was very young when it all happened, but that's not the worst of it." The attorney picked up another document. "The adoption process was conducted irregularly. There are indications that Ms. Miller was coerced into giving up the child, possibly when she was already showing signs of mental instability." "And how does this affect our case?" "In several ways," Dr. Miller replied. "First, if the other child's family knows about this current situation, they may want to file for custody of Tabitha and Samuel, claiming the right to keep the siblings together." "But they have no relationship with these children," Richard protested. "In the eyes of the law, they're siblings, and judges tend to favor maintaining family ties." The attorney paused before continuing. Furthermore, Ms. Miller's history of mental problems can be traced back to that time. If she wasn't in a condition to make decisions about that child, all subsequent processes, including the custody of Tabitha and Samuel, can be questioned. Richard felt his head spinning with all that information. What can we do? At the moment, our best strategy is to focus on the immediate well-being of the children. Today's incident at the hospital strengthens our argument that they need urgent protection. Dr. Miller picked up some more papers. It also helps that you have the financial resources and stability to take care of them. But, Richard asked, feeling that there was more, but we need to be prepared. If this story of the other child comes to light during the hearing, things could get very complicated. At that moment, Richard's phone rang. It was Ms. Evans. Mr. Harding. Her voice was tense. You need to come back to the hospital. Tabitha woke up and is very agitated. She remembered something. Richard said goodbye to the attorney and hurried back to the hospital. He found Tabitha sitting on the bed, hugging her knees, with a distant look that frightened him. Tabitha, he called softly. What happened, honey? She raised her eyes to him, and there was something different in them, a shadow of memory that seemed to weigh too much for someone so young. I remembered, she said in a low voice. I remembered why Mommy got like that, why she started drinking that bad stuff. Richard sat next to her on the bed, his heart beating fast. Do you want to tell me? Tabitha nodded slowly. It was because of John. Richard's heart almost stopped. That was the name of Ms. Miller's other son. Who is John, honey? My brother, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. I was very little, but I remember him. He used to take me to play in the playground. He gave me ice cream secretly. She stopped, tears starting to form in her eyes. Then one day some people came to the house, important people wearing nice clothes. They talked a lot with Mommy, she cried a lot. After that, John went away with them. Richard felt his heart clench. And what happened then? Mommy got different. First she just cried a lot. Then she started drinking that stuff that made her weird. Daddy tried to make her stop, but she didn't stop. Then Daddy had the accident and she got even worse. Tabitha stopped talking, hugging her knees tighter. Is there anything else you remember? Richard asked gently. Once, she began, her voice almost a whisper. I heard Mommy talking on the phone. She was crying and yelling at someone, saying that she wanted to see John. The person on the other line said she couldn't, that she had signed a paper. After that, she started saying that everyone wanted to steal her children. The pieces were beginning to fit together in Richard's mind. The trauma of losing her first child had triggered the whole process of Ms. Miller's mental deterioration. That's why she hid Sammy in that hole. Tabitha continued, the tears now running freely down her face. She kept saying that they were going to take him too, that they were going to take everyone like they took John. Richard pulled her into a hug, feeling her small body tremble with stifled sobs. Do you think... She hesitated. Do you think John still remembers us, that he's okay? The question caught Richard by surprise. How to explain to a 5-year-old the complexity of that situation? I'm sure he's okay, he replied finally. And even though time has passed, some memories are kept in the heart forever. Tabitha nodded against his chest. I wish he could meet Sammy, she said quietly. I wish he knew he had another little brother. Before Richard could answer, Samuel's doctor appeared at the door. Her face was serious. Mr. Harding, she called, we need to talk. It's about Samuel's latest tests. Fear returned to clench Richard's chest. What else did that day have in store for them? The doctor led Richard to a small meeting room, but before they could leave the room, Tabitha grabbed his hand tightly. Don't leave me alone, she pleaded, the fear evident in her voice. Please. She can come along. the doctor said gently. In fact, it's good that she comes. What I have to say concerns both of them. They followed the doctor in silence, Tabitha still holding Richard's hand firmly. In the room, there were several x-rays and tests spread out on a lighted table. Samuel's latest tests showed something unexpected, the doctor began, picking up one of the images. The infection is responding well to the medication, better than we expected. But we found something that worries us. What is it? Richard asked, feeling Tabitha squeeze his hand tighter. Samuel has a congenital heart condition, the doctor explained. It's something that could probably have been detected and treated during the pregnancy if there had been adequate prenatal care. Is it serious? Richard's voice trembled slightly. It's a condition that will require surgery, she replied. Not immediately. First, we need to resolve the infection and he needs to gain weight, but it will be necessary in the coming months. Surgery. Tabitha's small voice sounded frightened. But he's so little. The doctor knelt down to get to her level. Yes, he's little, but he's very strong. You've seen how he's already overcome so much, haven't you? Tabitha nodded, tears shining in her eyes. But what if he can't take it? That's why we need to wait for him to get stronger, the doctor explained. And you can help a lot with that, you know. That music you sing to him. I notice that his heart rate stabilizes when he hears your voice. Really? Tabitha asked, a small light of hope emerging in her eyes. Really? In fact, the doctor hesitated for a moment. I would like to make a proposal. Have you heard of music therapy? Tabitha shook her head negatively. It's when we use music to help people get better. We have a music therapist who works here at the hospital, especially with babies. She could teach you more songs, show you how to use your voice to help your little brother even more. Tabitha's face lit up slightly. I can learn more songs for Sammy? You can, smiled the doctor, and that will help a lot in his recovery. Richard watched the interaction, feeling a mixture of emotions. On the one hand, his heart ached to know that Samuel would need to go through another ordeal. On the other hand, seeing how Tabitha clung to any possibility of helping her brother filled him with admiration. How much will the surgery cost? He asked. It's a complex and expensive procedure, the doctor admitted. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. First, we need to focus on making him strong enough. At that moment, they were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Miss Evans, and her expression was grave. Mr. Harding, she called, the judge has moved the hearing to this afternoon, in 2 hours. Richard felt his stomach sink. That soon? After the incident with Ms. Miller, he wants to resolve this as quickly as possible, Ms. Evans explained. But there's one more thing. What is it? He asked, although he feared the answer. John's adoptive family. They found out about the situation. They're on their way to the courthouse. Tabitha, who was distracted talking to the doctor about the songs she could learn, turned abruptly upon hearing her brother's name. John, she asked, her eyes wide. Is he coming? Ms. Evans shook her head gently. No, honey. It's his adoptive parents who are coming. But why? Tabitha's voice sounded confused and a little scared. Do they want to take us too? Richard knelt beside her, holding her small hands in his. No one is going to take you or Samuel anywhere. Honey, I promised I would take care of you, remember? But what if the judge doesn't let us? She asked, the fear evident in her voice. What if he sends us away like they sent John away? The question hit Richard like a punch to the gut. How to explain the complexity of a legal system to a 5-year-old? How to promise something that didn't depend entirely on him? Tabitha, he began, choosing his words carefully, I can't promise that it will be easy, but I can promise that I'll fight for you with all my strength, and even if it takes a long time, even if it's difficult, I won't give up. Ever. The girl hugged him tightly, burying her face in his neck. I'm scared, she whispered. "I don't want to lose anyone else." "Mr. Harding," the doctor called softly, "I think I have something that can help." She took an envelope from her folder. "These are Samuel's latest tests, showing his progress since he arrived here. And there's also a detailed report on how Tabitha's presence has been crucial to his recovery. This could be important for the judge to see." Richard took the envelope gratefully. "Every little piece of evidence could make a difference. And there's one more thing," the doctor continued. "Samuel doesn't have a birth certificate yet, right? That means that technically he doesn't even exist to the system. If we can prove that you're the most capable person to take care of him at this critical time." She was interrupted by a familiar sound. Samuel's monitors in the ICU were beeping again. "No," Tabitha whispered, the panic returning to her eyes. "Sammy!" Everyone ran to the ICU. The baby was agitated, his vital signs altered. "He must have missed you," the doctor said to Tabitha. "Want to sing to him?" The girl didn't hesitate. She approached the crib and began to sing softly. Like magic, the monitors began to stabilize. "See?" smiled the doctor. "That'll go in the report too. It's clear proof of the bond between them." Richard watched the scene, his heart aching. In a few hours, a judge would decide the fate of those children. And although he tried to stay optimistic, the fear of what could happen consumed him. That's when his phone vibrated with a message. It was from Dr. Miller. "I have news about John's adoptive parents. You need to know this before the hearing. It's urgent." Dr. Miller's office was even more cluttered than before, with papers scattered everywhere. The attorney seemed agitated, flipping through documents frantically when Richard entered. "Sit down," he requested, without taking his eyes off the papers. "What we discovered is, well, complex." Richard sat down, his heart beating fast. He had left Tabitha with Ms. Evans, promising to be back in time for the hearing. The girl was nervous, but the music therapist had arrived just in time and was now teaching her new songs to sing to Samuel. "What did you find out?" he asked, trying to control the anxiety in his voice. "John's adoptive parents," Dr. Miller began, finally finding the document he was looking for, "are Robert and Helen Macy. He's a businessman, owner of a supermarket. Jane, she's a pediatrician." "And?" Richard prompted, feeling that there was more. "And they have an interesting history with adoptions," the attorney continued. "This wasn't the first time they tried to adopt. There were 2 other attempts before, both problematic." "How do you mean, problematic?" "In both cases, there were allegations that they had pressured the birth mothers to give up the children. Nothing was proven, but—" He hesitated, picking up another document. "There's a pattern. They always looked for mothers in vulnerable situations, offered money, made promises." Richard felt his stomach churn. "And that's what they did with Ms. Miller?" "From what we've been able to gather, yes. At the time, Miss Miller was already showing signs of depression after her husband's death. She was alone, taking care of John and Tabitha, who was still a baby. Robert and Helen appeared offering help." "What kind of help?" "Money, mainly. They promised they would give John a better life, that they would help Miss Miller with Tabitha. But after the adoption was finalized, they simply disappeared. Miss Miller tried to maintain contact, but they got a court order prohibiting any approach." "My God," Richard murmured, running his hands over his face. "So that's what broke her." "It was probably the last straw," Dr. Miller agreed. "But here comes the part that can help us. We discovered that they never fulfilled their part of the agreement. The money they promised was never paid, the help with Tabitha never happened, and more importantly, they lied in the adoption process." "How so?" "They omitted the previous adoption attempts, the allegations they had suffered. If that comes to light now," he left the sentence hanging in the air, its meaning clear. "But why are they showing up now?" Richard asked. "After so long?" "That's the most interesting part," said Dr. Miller, picking up a newspaper. "Robert Macy is trying to enter politics. He's building an image of a defender of the family, using the story of John's adoption as propaganda. The existence of two other siblings, especially in the current circumstances, would be a disaster for his campaign, Richard completed, beginning to understand. Exactly. That's why I believe they're going to try one of two things. Either ask for custody of Tabitha and Samuel to keep the story under control, or try to prevent you from staying with the children, so that they end up in the system and the connection with John never comes to light. Richard felt a wave of anger grow in his chest. They destroyed Ms. Miller's life, abandoned the promises they made, and now they want to use these children as political pawns? That's why we need to be prepared, said Dr. Miller. The hearing is in an hour. If they try anything... He was interrupted by Richard's phone ringing. It was Miss Evans, and her voice was tense. Mr. Harding, you need to come back to the hospital now. It's Samuel. Richard's heart stopped. What happened? He had a sudden turn for the worse. The doctor is with him now, but... She hesitated. Tabitha is desperate. She's only calling. For you. Richard got up immediately. I'm going. Dr. Miller, meet us at the courthouse. Do what you can to delay the hearing if necessary. He drove as fast as he could to the hospital, his heart hammering in his chest. When he arrived at the ICU, the scene he found broke his heart. Tabitha was leaning against the glass of the crib, singing between sobs. Samuel was paler than ever, and the monitors showed worrying signs. What happened? He asked the doctor. His heart is very overworked, she explained in a low voice. The heart condition we discovered, it's worsening faster than we expected. He needs the surgery. Yes, but... She hesitated. He's still very weak. Surgery now would be extremely risky. And if you don't do it? The doctor looked at Samuel, then at Tabitha, and finally at Richard. Without the surgery, he won't last long. Tabitha, who had apparently overheard the conversation, turned to them. Her little face was marked by tears, but there was a surprising determination in her eyes. Do the surgery, she said. Sammy is strong. He can take it. Honey, the doctor began gently, it's not that simple. Yes, it is, Tabitha insisted. He endured being in the cold. He endured being hungry. He endured everything. He'll endure this too. I know he will. Richard knelt beside her. Tabitha, it's very dangerous. More dangerous than being in that hole, she asked, her voice trembling. More dangerous than when Mommy disappeared and left us alone. He survived all that. Please let him try. The doctor and Richard exchanged a look. There was something in Tabitha's conviction that was impossible to ignore. I'll gather the team, the doctor said finally. But we need authorization from the legal guardian. The hearing is in less than an hour, Ms. Evans reminded them. Then we have to hurry, Richard said. Let's go to the courthouse now. Doctor, prepare everything. As soon as we have the judge's authorization, we'll start the surgery. Tabitha grabbed his hand. I'm going too. Honey, you need to rest. No, she interrupted firmly. Sammy needs to know that I'm there. That I won't abandon him, ever. At that moment, they heard voices in the hallway. It was John's adoptive parents who had somehow found out where the children were. Where are my son's siblings? Demanded. A male voice. I have the right to see them. Tabitha shrank against Richard, the fear evident in her eyes. But there was something more there. A strength that came from the love for her brother, a determination to protect him at any cost. I won't let them take Sammy, she whispered. I won't let anyone separate us again. Richard picked her up, feeling her small body tremble. They won't separate you, he promised. We'll fight together, for you, for Samuel, and for the truth. As they headed to the courthouse, passing through the back corridors to avoid Robert and Helen, Richard knew that the next few hours would be decisive, not only for the custody of the children, but for Samuel's very life. Everyone's fate was about to be decided, and he prayed he would have enough strength to face what was to come. The courtroom was silent, when Richard entered with Tabitha in his arms. The girl clung to him tightly, her frightened eyes scanning the unfamiliar environment. In one corner of the room, Robert and Helen Macy watched them with calculated expressions. On the other side, Dr. Miller organized a pile of documents. On the table, the judge, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, was studying some papers on his desk. When he raised his eyes, his gaze lingered on Tabitha for a moment. "This is the child in question?" he asked. Before anyone could answer, Tabitha spoke up, her voice small but firm. "I'm Tabitha, and I need to talk to you. It's very important." A slight smile appeared on the judge's face. "Is it really? And what do you want to talk about, Tabitha?" "About my little brother," she replied. "Sammy. He's very sick and needs to have surgery. But they said he can only have it if you let him." The judge frowned, looking at the attorneys present. "I haven't been informed of any surgery." Dr. Miller stood up quickly. "Your Honor, we just received this documentation from the hospital." He handed over the envelope that the doctor had prepared. "The baby has a serious heart condition that requires urgent surgical intervention." "Objection!" Helen Macy's voice sounded loud and clear. "As a pediatrician, I question the need for such a risky surgery on a newborn." "Have you examined the child?" the judge asked. "No, but..." "Then you're not in a position to question the diagnosis of the doctors who are following the case," the judge cut her off. He turned his attention to the documents, reading them carefully. At that moment, Robert Macy stood up. "Your Honor, if you'll allow me, I would like to state our position. As the adoptive parents of these children's older brother, we feel that we have not only the right, but the moral duty to..." "The moral duty," Richard interrupted, unable to contain himself any longer. "Where was that moral duty when you abandoned the promises you made to these children's mother, when you prohibited her from seeing her own son?" "Order!" the judge ruled, banging his gavel. "Mr. Harding, I understand your indignation, but we need to maintain civility." That's when Richard's phone rang. It was the doctor from the hospital. His face paled as he heard the message. "Your Honor," he said, turning off the phone, "I need to inform you that the baby's condition has worsened significantly. If we don't perform the surgery in the next few hours, he's going to go to heaven like Daddy." Tabitha's voice sounded small and scared. The silence that followed was heavy. Even Robert and Helen seemed affected by the evident fear in the girl's voice. "Your Honor," began Dr. Miller, "I would like to present some evidence about the true motivation of the Macys in this case." He began to expose everything he had discovered: the other adoption attempts, the allegations, the unfulfilled agreement with Ms. Miller, Robert's political ambitions. With each revelation, the couple seemed to wither in their chairs. "This is absurd," Robert protested. "We're here only for the well-being of the children." "Really?" Dr. Miller questioned. "Then why was your first act upon learning of the existence of these siblings to hire a public relations team?" The judge watched everything carefully, making occasional notes. When everyone had finished speaking, he turned to Tabitha. "Tabitha," he called gently, "would you like to say something?" The girl straightened up in Richard's lap, gathering all the courage she had. "Please," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "let Sammy have the surgery. And let us stay with Richard. He promised he would take care of us, and he never lied to me. Never." She paused, swallowing a sob. "Everyone always leaves. Daddy left, Grandma left. They took John, Mummy got sick. But Richard isn't going to leave. I know he's not." Tears streamed silently down Richard's face as she spoke. The judge observed the interaction between the two with interest. "Mr. Harding," he called, "are you aware of the responsibilities that you are proposing to assume? 2 children, one of them with serious medical needs." "Your Honor," Richard replied, "when I found those children on that highway, I wasn't looking for responsibilities. But now I can't imagine my life without them. I'll do anything it takes to keep them safe and loved." The judge nodded slowly, looking again at his papers. The silence in the room was almost palpable as everyone awaited his decision. "Considering the urgency of the medical situation," he began finally, "and all the evidence presented, I determine that temporary custody of the children is granted to Mr. Richard Harding, with immediate authorization for all necessary medical procedures." Tabitha let out a small cry of joy, hugging Richard tightly. "As for Mr. and Mrs. Macy," the judge continued, his voice more severe, "I order a full investigation into the irregularities pointed out in the adoption process of the older brother." Robert and Helen stood up, ready to protest, but the judge silenced them with a gesture. "And one more thing," he added, "considering that these children are in fact siblings, I suggest that you reconsider your position on contact between them. Family ties are important." Richard wasted no time. With Tabitha still in his arms, he ran out of the courthouse. The doctor had already been notified and the surgical team was prepared. When they arrived at the hospital, they found Samuel already being prepped for surgery. Tabitha insisted on seeing him before they took him away. "Sammy," she whispered, her small hand touching the glass of the crib, "you need to be strong one more time, okay? Just this one more time. Then we're going home, to our real home." The surgery lasted 6 hours. They were the longest hours in Richard and Tabitha's lives. She didn't stop singing for a single moment, even when her voice began to fail from exhaustion. Finally, the doctor appeared in the waiting room. Her face, though tired, showed a smile. "He made it," she announced. "The surgery was a success." 3 months passed. Samuel recovered completely and was finally able to go home. Richard transformed one of the rooms of his mansion into a nursery, and the room next door became Tabitha's enchanted kingdom, with pink walls and a growing collection of storybooks. Ms. Miller continued in treatment and was progressing. In the supervised visits, she already showed signs of the caring mother she had once been. The road to recovery would be long, but she was finally getting the help she needed, and then one Sunday afternoon, the doorbell rang. When Richard opened the door, he found Helen Macy, alone, without the intimidating presence of her husband. "John," she said simply, "he wants to meet his siblings." Tabitha, who was playing in the living room with Samuel, raised her head upon hearing that. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. That night, after the children fell asleep, Samuel in his crib and Tabitha in her new bed clutching the old teddy bear that was now clean and mended, Richard watched the scene with his heart full. Life had strange ways of changing. A chance encounter on a highway, a distant cry coming from a vacant lot, and suddenly everything was transformed. He had lost important business deals in those days when it all began, but he had gained something much more precious, a family. In Tabitha's room, the light from the lamp projected stars on the ceiling, her new obsession since Richard had explained to her that the people we love and who leave us become stars in the sky. Now she always said that her father and grandmother were up there taking care of her, Samuel, and even her mother. And soon, very soon, there would be a new chapter in that story, the reunion with John. But that would be the beginning of a new story. For now, on that quiet night, everything was at peace. A peace built with love, courage, and the extraordinary strength of a girl who never gave up on protecting her little brother, even when the whole world seemed to be against her. A story that began with pain and fear, but that ended up proving that sometimes the strongest families are not those we are born into, but those we build along the way, with love, determination, and above all, hope.